And while we were tracking this whale, this ship came through. I had to take evasive action in my boat. And this is the dive record of the whale. And right here is where the close approach to the ship. And this is ship noise from the tag. Here's the ship going by. And this whale actually was about to surface right in the path of this ship. And fortunately, it did make a little bit of an avoidance dive there. And the interesting thing to us is this is going to, with this acoustic record, we'll be able to actually look at it. What sound level did this whale actually respond? It had to be really loud for it to actually make a change in behavior. But in this case, it did. Okay. Now, one of the things we've been trying to develop is, especially for the ship strike work, these tags that are on for 4, 5, 6 hours are great. But they're not really giving us the kind of data that is really essential to understand, you know, the types of encounters these whales are frequently having. I mean, it was amazing to us that just with these short durations of tag deployments, we were getting these near misses. But they were still just a tiny portion of the whales and a tiny portion of the time period they were in the shipping lanes. So we started to use these tags like we have here and experiment with using short darts to basically try to get more like a multi-day deployment on them. And so we actually started with this last year. We did some experiments with Monterey Bay, an area where we had some humpback whales that were staying. So we deployed the tag, and this is the tag site blown up after the tags come out. And there's 2 small indentations there from those darts that held it. And initially we used the same kind of darts that are being used on those limpet satellite tags, but now we're actually going to smaller darts than that because we're not after longer term, you know, weeks of deployment, but we're trying to get it where it's more than a few hours. We've done enough of these that we've become convinced this is more on the level of an impact of a biopsy, which is a real impact to the whale, but nothing like the sort of implant satellite tags that we use. So we've been doing that. This first set of deployments we did this year have yielded the kind of data I've showed you, but in a much richer variety. And so these are some close encounters between ships and humpback whales from those tags. And again, this is a track of a ship and a track of a whale that's come out. These tags here have a GPS in them, so we get very high precision positions. And this was a relatively new development. GPSs have been around for quite a while, but part of the challenge is these whales are only at the surface for a second or two. And if you know GPSs, they take a while to lock on the satellite. So it required the development of what's called fast lock GPS technology, where the tag can get a rapid snapshot of the GPS satellites in that just a few seconds that the whale's at the surface. But then we can get these very accurate GPS quality positions. Oh, I skipped over a slide there. Let me go back. And things got a lot more interesting once we could do that. Now, these are highly detailed GPS tracks now of blue whales from these tags that were on, in this case, multiple days to several weeks. And these different colors, I don't know how well these are showing up for you. You can probably see the yellow one in detail. That's all the movements of one whale over more than a 1-week period. And these are the shipping lanes. We're getting the most detailed view of how these whales are interacting and moving through these areas with ships, not just in the daytime, but at nighttime as well. And we're now going through the huge set of data. Literally hundreds and hundreds of ships transited these shipping lanes during this period this whale was tagged and tracked. And so now we're looking at the intersection of all of those ship movements and whale movements. We did have one of the whales, so this map here, so LA Long Beach is right here, busiest port we have, so shipping lanes going to the north and to the south from there. This is Santa Monica Bay, and this is a blow-up of this area right here. And of course, one of the whales did this long track all the way down Baja. That's the one that went down to down south, and the tag came off just as that hurricane was hitting Cabo San Lucas. That took us, these tags also do have a satellite transmitter piggybacked on it, and so we could actually track the whale's movement with not very accurate positions from the satellite, GPS positions being stored on the tag, but then we could see when it came off, and it took over a week before we could actually find a boat operating down there that we could charter to go out and recover it, going out of San Carlos and Magdalena Bay to recover this tag. And this is tag number 6, I believe it was this tag right here. And the dive records you get from that, so here's one of those day-night extracts, but this is what it looks like more on a 10-day period. And you can see day, night, day, night, day, night, day, night, day. You can see that very dramatic pattern in dive record. But getting this kind of high-resolution tag data was kind of very new for us. So some of what we've learned so far, it's already this very little horizontal avoidance by blue whales to closely approaching ships, increased surface time following close approaches, some evidence of vertical avoidance of close approach of ships, but at a very, very slow rate of ascent. It's not a very effective way for them to get away from ships. And then that sharp day-night differences. Okay. We're almost at 4 o'clock. I think I can just go very quickly over this. This is the behavioral response study, the Navy sonar. It's a collaborative study with many researchers. Then, I'm going to just jump over a bunch of slides and just cut right to a few key results here that come from that, because I think it's important. The study has involved a variety of whale species and deployments. CEEs up here mean controlled exposure experiments, and that can be, those can either be to our scaled sound source, or this handful of deployments we have where there was a real Navy ship that transmitted Navy sonar. And you can see our main species are Cuviers and Baird's-beaked whales, blue whales, fin whales, and Risso's dolphins are our primary species. I'll show you just a few kind of key results. Let's go here. These have come out in publication. Even though the study is ongoing, we still have 2 more years of field work. We already have, I think, 5 publications that are out on these results, because some of these results we think are very timely. So this publication in 2012 and 2013 documented response by blue whales to that scaled sound source. It wasn't a dramatic response, but it was, I'm not going to kind of go into too much detail here, but it did document a change in feeding behavior on the part of blue whales, even to relatively low levels of exposure of sound. In the case of Cuvier's beaked whales, the response was much more dramatic to our scaled sound source than what we saw in blue whales. And in fact, these animals, as soon as that mid-frequency Navy sonar was above background detectable levels, we saw a pretty dramatic change in the whale's behavior. In this case here, this is a whale. This blue line shows that it was echolocating. These red dots show the sound intensity that it had as a received level. And you can see this animal actually at a certain level stopped echolocating, and it actually changed its diving behavior, and it moved away from the source. Okay. I think the more, the results that we're working on now are some of these with the real Navy ship, and it actually looks like when you have a real Navy ship that's much, much further away, the response by the animals looks like isn't just a function of how loud is the sound to the animal. It looks like the animals can perceive distance. So it looks like the response is a function of both received, how loud is the sound it's hearing, and how far away is the sound. Looks like our best explanation at this point. Anyway, okay, let me talk about gray whales, because we're at 4 o'clock and I want to leave time for questions. Gray whales, now we're kind of going back to more a biology type study. And the picture of gray whales has gotten a lot more interesting in the last 5 years. But for a while, we used to think gray whales are the species we understood pretty well. They had this well-documented recovery from whaling. But there have been kind of several very interesting issues that have come out. One has been the existence of what's sometimes called the Pacific Coast Feeding Group. The overall eastern North Pacific gray whale population numbers about 20,000 animals, has recovered, went through a major mortality event in the late 1990s, early 2000. But about 200 animals feed in this area off Northern California, Oregon, Washington, British Columbia. And unlike that larger population that migrates up to Alaskan waters to feed, these animals spend the spring, summer, and fall feeding, and it looks like it's the same animals coming back every year. Now that had pretty big implications for the potential impact of something like resumption of whaling by the macaw, because it's a very different kind of potential threat if you're taking 4 or 5 animals a year out of a population of 20,000 than if there was this discrete group that they ended up taking that was only a couple hundred. That would have a very different impact. So, you know, some of our experience around here is a little different in that the gray whales that we get into northern Puget Sound and around Whidbey Island aren't really part of that Pacific Coast feeding group. There are more whales from that overall migration that migrates north that have learned to come in here and feed for 2 to 3 months at a time. So I've already sort of given you maybe 3 groups of gray whales. The ones from the overall eastern North Pacific gray whale population that migrate past. We have our Pacific Coast feeding group of a couple of hundred animals that feed kind of almost year-round in the Pacific Northwest. And then we have those animals that come into this area off Whidbey and Camino Islands that are here only in spring. We do get whales that wander through other times of year, but the regular returning animals are primarily here from March through May, sometimes February, sometimes into June, but the regular animals are primarily that March to May period. And they heavily come in and feed on some of these intertidal ghost shrimp beds. So partly, you know, concerned about the resumption of macaw whaling, we've begun a long-term photo ID study of gray whales. It follows up on a pioneering work of Jim Darling that started this work on the Vancouver Island coast. But since the late 90s, Cascadia has become the central repository for IDs, and now we have about 1,500 different gray whales identified by natural markings that we track, with a focus on those ones that come into and are in both inside waters or are part of that Pacific Coast feeding group. Now the picture got even a little more complicated a few years ago, because over here off Sakhalin Island in Russia was the primary feeding ground of what's been described as the Western North Pacific gray whale, or sometimes called the Korean stock of gray whales. And it existed historically. There had been hunting off Korea. It was a population thought to feed in the Sea of Okhotsk and breed somewhere off China. And studies that had been done in the last 20 years off Sakhalin Island here in the Sea of Okhotsk had identified a group of about 140, 150 gray whales that were thought to be the remnant population of that Western North Pacific gray whale population. But using implant-type satellite tags, those are those longer-term tags deployed by Oregon State University Bruce May. When animals were tagged in that population, instead of migrating south to China that they expected, the first one in 2011 ended up coming all the way over to off the Washington coast and then starting to migrate south. And deployments that were done after that, the next year, showed the same thing, with two of the animals that they got longer-term tracks on also headed over this way. So right now, it's a little bit unclear. The Western gray whale has typically been considered one of the more endangered populations of gray whales. But now this has sort of thrown a bit of confusion. So gray whales that we thought we had figured out, people are puzzled. Does that mean those animals that feed in the Sea of Okhotsk now are just, animals that have recolonized that area from the eastern North Pacific, and maybe the Western gray whales are wiped out? Or is it a mixture of those animals? There are genetic data and a couple of publications that still suggest there seem to be at least some Western gray whales still there, and there still are sightings of gray whales off Japan and other areas that suggest something exists there, but it's really confused even that view of the distinction between eastern and western gray whales. Our animals that feed in this area here, focusing in, these northern Puget Sound animals, some are distinct, very distinctly marked. An animal that has this big white patch, so it's, we gave it the name Patch years ago, or we affectionately call it Whale 49. And so it's an animal that has been seen virtually every year going back to the initial years. And I'll show you you know, again, I don't want you to read these numbers. Each row here is a different individual. And each column is a year starting with 1990. And what I want you to see is there's a core group of a little over a half dozen animals that we've been seeing virtually every year. Same individual coming to the same areas to feed. And most of them are males. So I have the sex over here. In fact, of the animals we've been able to get a biopsy in sex, we have 5 males and 2 females. And interestingly enough, we've never seen any of these animals with a calf, but now that we know the sexes, when we look at some of the known females, there's an interesting, they tend to have more regular gaps in their sighting histories than the males. And it's starting to maybe suggest that even though we have mostly males, maybe some of the females that are reproducing may not come to this area when they have a calf. They're migrating later in the year, which these animals are known to do, and maybe they just skip coming here to feed. So this is an area, this is a kind of a fascinating little group of whales, partly because it's the same animals as some of the longest, most regular sightings of a baleen whale we've had anywhere. Some of these whales associate with each other and travel with each other. Baleen whales aren't supposed to form these long-term social bonds, but yet you'll see the same animals together traveling. Many of the people that live around here, I'm sure many of you in the audience probably know these whales and familiar with them. It's become a really interesting question. It's one we're hoping to explore. I'm going to show you a little bit of what we're going to do in a second. I did want to show a couple of things on strandings. These are how many gray whales die, have been documented dying every year. This is this major mortality event. It's been averaging about 4 to 8 a year. But in 1999 and 2000, we had about 50 between the 2 years. And that's when that major mortality and unusual mortality event was described. Most of those animals were animals that were starving to death. It looked like that might have been both a variation in the food supply and the Alaska feeding grounds intersecting with a growing, recovering gray whale population. Main time for strandings is generally this period from April through June. This is strandings by month. And you'll see we've had a few strandings every month of the year, not too many in January, which is going to take us to this most recent stranding. A lot of these animals are animals that have kind of very emaciated, but we do have a variety of causes, human causes of death, entanglement, and ship strikes that these animals have been exposed to. We've been able to disentangle some of these animals when we encounter them alive. This is our most recent animal, the animal you've been hearing about in the news if you've been following it, that was discovered a few days ago by the ferry dock and got towed this morning to a Port of Seattle property, and this is what it looked like. This is as of about 11 o'clock this morning, and these are propeller strikes. So basically this is an animal from the condition of these strikes. It was struck while alive by a large ship's propeller. So again, those kind of that mention of ship strike as a threat in this case is very relevant to this most recent animal. It looks like the animal probably died sometime earlier this week. It was just over a 30-foot female. This blubber layer was really thick, what you'd expect from an animal that had been feeding. This is the end of its feeding period, and when it should have been migrating south to breeding grounds and starting that annual fast. And it looked like it was in healthy condition prior to being struck by the ship. So, and I think this is my next to last slide. I was just going to point out that one of the things we're really looking to do is apply some of these techniques that we've been using with blue and humpback whales and focus a little bit of that kind of research on the gray whales that are in this region. Part of that is because of concern, especially on local residence parts here that's now been taken up by Department of Natural Resources, potential conflicts between the commercial harvest of ghost shrimp and the gray whale feeding on ghost shrimp in these waters. And so partly we want to use a couple of these techniques to try to identify to what degree and what specific area gray whales are feeding. We know they feed in these intertidal areas on ghost shrimp. We don't know if that's their exclusive feeding area and what proportion of their diet relies on that intertidal ghost shrimp that is part of the commercial harvest and what part is more subtidal feeding. And so those tags would help do that. We've been using opportunistic photo IDs coming from the whale watch operations, have been really useful, but those tend to cover very defined areas, so we'll be adding some dedicated small boat surveys to survey the whole area. We'll be using some of these video tags to document their feeding and to calibrate the tag data. Just like the talk earlier this morning, we're trying to use more UAVs. We have a UAV we started to use last year. I don't want to get into too much detail on the permit aspects of that. We have gotten part of the permit route completed for that. We'll put that added to our marine mammal permit for using a UAV. But if that all works out, we may be using UAVs to a small degree, as was described for killer whales this morning by John Gerber. Okay, last slide. Just kind of, those of you that are interested in learning more, I think Orca Network, and especially the Whale Center in Langley now, are great sources of information. I mentioned Cascadia Research, all of our publications and reports. We don't have a very glitzy website, it's kind of bare bones, but all of PDFs of all of our publications and reports go on there, so you can get a hold of our reports. We do try to keep up when we're doing, during our field operations, a little bit on our Facebook page. You can follow a little bit of our field work, especially what we'll be doing this spring through that way. And then I just kind of urge, there are a number of groups of the issues I touched on, including Navy sonar. I'm in an interesting position. I work extensively now. The BRS funding, the BRS study is funded by the U.S. Navy. So I work, Cascadia, has a contract from the U.S. Navy to do that research. I view that something that, it's good the Navy does that, but it creates a clear potential conflict of interest, both for the Navy and for researchers in my position. I try to continue my work with NRDC, Natural Resources Defense Council, and actively served as one of their expert witnesses and opposing the Navy and suing the Navy on sonar exercises. So I try to play both aspects of that. I do think, it's a tough position that our current funding situation puts into it. I do a whole talk about conflict of interest, and I think the Navy should be taking a responsibility at funding research, but I think we need to put more pressure on the Navy to have that funding go through an independent body. So it isn't the Navy themselves choosing who does the research and how it's done. And that's one of the ways, and I think the only way the Navy will do that will be, I think, if people put pressure that that's a potential conflict of interest that needs to be recognized. But right now, we operate with Navy funding. We have a few conditions that we require. We insist that there be no restriction at all on data dissemination and reporting. So just like what I showed you here, I don't have to clear that with the Navy. All of our reports and publications go out without a requirement of Navy approval. That's part of the bottom line of maintaining some level of independence from that. But there's still that conflict of interest that's real. But I urge NRDC is a great group that kind of is one of the more educated environmental groups that battles the Navy on those issues. On the ship strike issue, there's a whale conservancy organization that's been working on the ship strike issue, and particularly in California, the Environmental Defense Center are two environmental groups that work a lot on ship strike issues, and feel free to contact me if you're interested in more information on that. Okay, I've left a little bit of time, but thank you for bearing with me going through all of these. No, so the question was, have we done the sonar studies in the Pacific Northwest? And everything we've done has been in the Southern California Bight only. Apparently there is a couple of studies being talked about by the Navy. I would be involved in them both in the Atlantic and some other areas, because I think, the Navy undertook the type of study I described for Southern California in several areas before Southern California. There was an effort in the Bahamas, there was an effort in the Mediterranean, and they tried to focus it solely on beaked whales. It involved large ships. It ended up being kind of millions and millions and millions of dollars. and only a few deployments. Our approach was a little different in that we took a multi-species approach, tried to not just focus solely on beaked whales and take advantage of kind of situations, both opportunistic and scaled source. And I think now, after having seen that, there are some efforts to kind of do other VRS type efforts, behavioral response, in other areas. There is currently an ongoing study in Europe that's being done by Europeans that involves other species and that we're collaborating with. So there is one ongoing study and plan to maybe apply it to some other areas as well.
Those thousands of miles of migration across the Pacific are just fascinating. Do we know how they navigate?
Yeah, so the question was, these thousands of mile migrations, how do these whales navigate? There's some hints out there, but bottom line is, I think that's still largely a question to be answered. And especially, I kind of view there's the broad scale navigation, but I wonder, even on the finer scale, how are these whales being so effective in finding these concentrations of prey? I mentioned that humpback whales are pretty loyal, returning to areas they know. But the blue whales travel much more widely looking for prey. I mentioned that change between the 1990s and 2000. How do they know it's a good year to go to Alaska rather than to feed off California? And when we track some of their movements, you can see them sort of sampling as they go, doing these exploratory dives, and then they find something and stay there. But I think they're using a whole other set of cues. So I think the navigation question is going to have 3 or 4 answers, and it's going to be both on that broad scale, but also questions on that fine scale. In the dark, not echolocating, how are they zeroing in on this prey and that they're required to survive? And one of the things that came out of some of those publications I showed you, if you look them up on our website, is that the key to success of these baleen whales, like this is work that Jeremy Goldberger has done. You look at that lunge feeding and filter feeding mechanism, for a large whale to feed on tiny krill. What it really boils down to, it's a very energetically costly. These animals dive a long way, they have to accelerate, and then they come to a complete stop, engulfing this prey. And if you look at it at a certain density of krill, it's actually taking more energy than it's worth, than you're getting out of the small number of krill. But at the highest densities of krill, it looks like one of the most efficient feeding mechanisms ever described for an animal. So all of that is reliant on finding that dense concentration of prey. So, they're very reliant on that. So I think there are a lot of mysteries about how they zero in on that, because they're very reliant on it. How about over here? Yeah, so what's the cost of these tags, and what's our success in finding them? The cost of the tag, this is probably one of the cheapest configurations. This whole configuration is about $8,000. At the higher end, we're probably talking $20,000, $25,000 a tag. But this tag here has probably been on 20, 30 whales already in that. And success in finding them, up to this last year, in the last 10 years, I had lost 0. For a while there, this fall, it looked like we had lost 4. But then the one got recovered off Baja, the one was found by the kayaker. We ended up getting 3 of them back, so right now, I did lose 1 last year. But I'm actually shocked we find as many as we have. We did lose a few in the first years of CritterCam deployment, and it actually turned out it was because we were underestimating. All the data we had at that point told us blue whales only dive to about 500 or 600 feet. And it turned out our transmitters and other things weren't rated to deeper than that. And when we finally got some of the data back, they were diving to 1,000 feet or more. And so it actually crushed some of those transmitters, and that's why we lost a few early versions of that. And I'm really happy that the tag we lost last year was the one I wanted to lose. It was the best thing to lose. And we got back the ones that were the most valuable. That one that I showed you with the almost ship, That was the one that was lost and not found until almost a month later by the kayaker. And so we went almost a month thinking we weren't going to get that data back. We had that whale, we saw it, we saw the close ship encounter, and then the tag stayed on into the night, and then we could not find it the next day. And it turned out it was, again, there was a failure on the transmitter part, so the only way it got found was because we have a if found, you know,